The Russian Revolution was a pivotal point in world history, as it replaced the Tsar with a provisional government. This led to the rise of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as the USSR. The revolution was predominantly upon the back of a pair of revolutions about 8 months apart, which came after Nicholas II abdicated the throne. Vladimir Lenin, along with Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky, led the Bolsheviks in their uprising over the provisional government. Lenin issued several treaties that brought about the end of the Russian Civil War, as well as leading the Bolsheviks in ending the Russian involvement in World War I. In a separate revolution in 1905, many workers sparked riots and mutinies around Russia. Strikes led to economic demands and an outcry for unions on the back of socialism, which was an uprising theology at the time. This specific revolution was sparked by Bloody Sunday, a significant event that occurred in St. Petersburg, where unarmed protesters were gunned down by the Imperial Guard. Bloody Sunday ultimately laid the groundwork for what would come 12 years later. Years later, as World War I broke out, the citizens of Russia directed their blame towards Nicholas II and the Romanov family. Attempting to remedy the situation and bring them to the war, Nicholas took over control of the army, which only proved to worsen the situation, as he was now being blamed for their countless defeats. Adding to the struggles of Nicholas, ultimately the last ruler of the Russian autocracy, his wife was left to control their crumbling empire. She began to form a relationship with Rasputin, a Russian monk who acted as her healer since she suffered from hemophilia. Rasputin gained considerable influence within the family and over the empire. Due to his growing influence, Rasputin was assassinated by the imperial family just days before the February Revolution broke out, leading to a tremendous disunity within the country. Morale was low within the army and within the country, as the nation was plagued with a famine and the loss of the war loomed. Prices were heavily inflated, leading to demands for higher wages within the factories, resulting in strikes and union formations. In February of 1917, the largest industrial plant in Petrograd began a strike. Gradually, every industrial plant in the city had been shut down due to the increase in strikes, as the number of striking workers increased to over 50,000. In retaliation, the Emperor Nicholas ordered the army to suppress the rioters, but when a group of soldiers disobeyed their orders and formed a mutiny, they were subsequently shot or forced to flee the country. As the whole city of Petrograd joined into the riot by tearing down all symbols of the regime, the autocracy quickly lost control of the city. It was decided that in order to regain law and order within Petrograd, Nicholas needed to abdicate the throne, which he did, and with no willing heir to the throne, Russia was left without a czar. A provisional government was subsequently created and began to compete with the Petrograd Soviet Union, a workers' council that was rapidly growing in number. The model for the Soviet Workers' Union was formed during the 1905 Russian Revolution. Leaders for the union were being chosen not to represent the whole country, but to represent specific parts of the population, specifically the poor workers. Interestingly, socialism was not heavily advocated for in the beginning, as they did not believe that the country would last if socialism was an economic system. The provisional government and the Soviet Workers' Union began to meet frequently to discuss politics and who would remain dominant power within the country. They ended up forming a dual power in an effort to control the uprising workers. Alexander Kerensky joined the Socialist Revolutionary Party and became an important factor in the meetings between the workers and the provisional government. Kerensky briefly headed the two parties despite multiple challenges, including the continuing World War I, which the Russians were badly losing, but also famines and supply shortages and defecting soldiers. Kerensky was ultimately overthrown by an uprising party, the Bolsheviks, who were led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was in favor of a Marxist-based communist revolution. With the removal of Alexander Kerensky, the citizens steadily became infuriated with the provisional government, and instead favored the Bolshevik Party, headed by Lenin along with Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. As October approached, a second revolution loomed, due to the increasing radicalism within Petrograd. Led by Lenin, the Marxist-based political system of communism spread throughout Russia and led the country into its second revolution in 8 months, known as the October Revolution. Unlike the one in February, this revolution was thoughtfully planned and orchestrated, rather than the impromptu February Revolution. Lenin and Trotsky led their fellow Bolsheviks in the coup as they revolted against the provisional government. The Red Army, led by Lenin, began a series of battles against the White Army, who were largely made of the bourgeoisie and those who were still loyal to the Tsarist government. These battles would later become known as the Russian Civil War. When citizens refused to support the Socialist Party, they were banned from the empire. This created mass political tension within the country and led to multiple battles and rebellions that would make up the Russian Civil War. Fighting between the Red Army and the White Army continued, but when more citizens and countries, including the Ukraine, began to ally with the Bolshevik-based Red Army, they ultimately claimed the victory. To make it official, Lenin executed the entire royal family, officially ending the revolution and marking a new age of the socialist rulers. However, to achieve the end of the rebellion, Vladimir Lenin had to issue a number of reforms in order to gain control over the revolutionaries. Lenin issued social and legal reforms, as well as a new economic policy that aided in ending the war. The biggest problem that led to the revolution in the first place was the formation of unions and strikes, and this is what Lenin aimed to fix first, with a decree that limited work hours to 8 hours per day. Also, Lenin's new economic policy established what he called state capitalism, which introduced a fair wage system and allowed everyone to own a private business. State capitalism is essentially a standard capitalist system, but it features state-controlled businesses. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, also ended their Russian involvement in World War I. The country entered troubling times during the war, and Lenin believed that for his government to be successful, the Russians needed to withdraw from the war. First, he issued his decree on peace to the Central Powers, the mainly European-based alliances that fought the Allied powers in World War I. His decree on peace was their withdrawal of Russia from the war. This led to further debate as Germany requested that they keep all their required territory from the war and that none of it be left in the possession of the Russians. Lenin and Trotsky felt that the preservation of the newly formed government was more important than territory, but this feeling was not unanimous. Negotiations were prolonged and ultimately concluded with Russia's ultimatum. They either agreed to let go of the territory, or Germany will go to war with Russia. Lenin and Trotsky urged their fellow Bolsheviks to accept the offer, but they hoped to call Germany's bluff, which ultimately resulted in Germany's conquering of small Russian-controlled territories. Negotiations continued, which only amounted to a large loss of Russian territory, and concluded with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending all conflict between Germany and Russia. The Soviet Union was formed from the foundations of the Bolshevik Party in the early 20th century, and wasn't dissolved until 7 years later in 1991.